Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda. Joe Biden drops out of the presidential race and endorses Vice President Kamala Harris as the Democratic nominee. The unprecedented decision plunges American politics into uncharted waters. Top Democrats rallied to support Harris, with her campaign receiving more than $50 million in donations in a single day. But her nomination is not guaranteed. The dollar weakens, gold gains as markets wrestle with fresh political uncertainty. We bring you all the market's reaction. So Democrat donations have surged, with senior figures in the party rallying around Kamala Harris after US President Joe Biden announced he would abandon his re-election bid. Briefly checking in on the market reaction then to this fresh political uncertainty in the US. You have a bit of a bid for US Treasuries. We focus on the US 10-year and the futures pointing slightly higher stateside after a challenging week last week, led by the softness in the tech trade. Currently, the S&P futures pointing to gains of 0.2%. The Bloomberg Dollar Index currently a little softer, and we'll see how the dollar reacts to this political uncertainty. Fresh records coming through for gold. The yellow metal at 2,405, gaining 0.2%. Let's get more in terms of the political and market reaction now from opening trade anchor Kriti Gupta and Bloomberg MLive's Mark Cranfield for a deep dive in terms of the market reaction. But first, let's go to Vonnie Quinn, standing by in Washington with the latest. Vonnie, what do we know after this shock announcement?
Yes, it was a shock, and it hasn't even been a full 12 hours yet, Tom, but it was a shock even to his staff, Biden's staff, who only knew a few minutes before he posted on X that he was dropping out of the race. This, of course, on his fourth day of confinement at home with COVID-19, following weeks of turmoil for the Democratic Party and an absolute resolve on the part of Biden to stay in the race, that is, until he didn't, which was today. Then we saw a massive amount of small dollar donations. In fact, it was close to $70 million. The biggest day in this race so far, more than 3 times the previous record, which was over $20 million. That was right after the debate. It's a very fascinating one because as soon as we got this endorsement from Biden of Kamala Harris, there was a trickle, and then there started to be a flood of endorsements from other leaders in the Democratic Party, including Jim Clyburn, for example, who had gotten Kamala and Biden into the race about 4 years ago. And, of course, donors who may come back as well. It is fascinating. She will need to pick a vice presidential pick as well. That doesn't have to come until at least 4 weeks from now for the convention. It could come, of course, any time.
And Vonnie, look, you're nodding to this. To what extent Kamala Harris is now locked in as the presidential candidate for the Democrats? It's, of course, not official. That won't happen until the DNC. But in terms of potential other contenders, to what extent is this a clear path for Harris at this point?
At this point, Tom, and I wouldn't have said this 12 hours ago, but at this point, it looks like it's pretty clear for Harris. It really looks like the Democratic Party wants to make a huge show of unity after a really great few weeks, it has to be said, for the RNC, which came out of the Republican convention very unified, if you like. It seems like the Democratic Party, with a couple of exceptions, for example, Nancy Pelosi, also the former President Barack Obama, who didn't actually endorse the current, person who's in the lead, which is Kamala Harris, but did suggest that there should be maybe an open convention. With those exceptions, it has been a full throttle, right, including state delegations. And that was one area where the Republicans were sort of tempted to make a legal challenge to this, to say, well, the delegates voted already for President Biden. They can't just suddenly change to Kamala Harris. It looks like they're preempting any kind of strike from the Republicans on that score and saying, no, state by state, we are completely and 100% behind Kamala Harris.
What have we been hearing from the Trump camp then?
Trump has been posting all day on Truth Social. He hasn't been able to hold back. We knew that there was a lot of money gone into preemptively creating ads and so forth to try and attack Kamala Harris. We knew that the Trump campaign presumed that it was going to be Kamala Harris if Biden did pull out. Well, all day long we've heard from Trump, who just can't seem to stop. And he's been on the attack, essentially, basically saying it's going to be easier to beat Harris than it would be to beat Biden. This, of course, was not the story before today. Before today, MAGA supporters were trying to keep Biden in the race, suggesting that that would be the easier path to the White House for the Republicans.
OK, Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn in Washington with all the latest. Vonnie, thank you very much indeed. Now, Joe Biden was quick, of course, to endorse his vice president, as Vonnie was saying, Kamala Harris, to take his place as Democratic nominee. Harris has spent the night making calls to senior Democrats to shore up support as she scrambles to formally secure that party's nomination. Let's get more from opening trade anchor Kriti Gupta. Kriti, remind our viewers who Kamala Harris is and to what extent she may or may not be able to unite this divided Democratic Party.
I think that's the key point there, that she isn't actually officially the Democratic nominee. In fact, she's not 100% there yet, despite getting that endorsement from President Biden. And that's where the dissent, and that's where her real kind of task lies ahead, is getting those dissenters within the party to actually back her. She has the support of the Clintons. She has the support of Nancy Pelosi, as Vonnie Quinn had said, but she does not have the support or the endorsement of Barack Obama, for example, who has not been vocal about pushing her forward. She's also been someone who has ran for president before. She has come under quite a bit of scrutiny on her policy for a lot of kind of domestic economic policy, including her immigration policy as well. And that's something Vonnie was alluding to, is something that the Trump camp is really going to be pushing her forward to. What we do know is that she's very strong in terms of the international audience, in terms of reiterating some of the Biden policies when it comes to things like defense, aid to Ukraine, etc. But when you look at a lot of the domestic polling, a lot of people look at Kamala Harris and say, we don't know what she stands for. And those are one of her criticisms back in 2019 when she ran for the 2020 race and ultimately pulled out.
OK, Kriti Gupta of the Opening Trade, thank you very much indeed on Kamala Harris, who she is and her potential prospects at this point. The implications, of course, of the Democratic Party and the US nation as a whole. Let's get more in terms of how the markets are reacting to this. And you can see the moves around the Bloomberg Dollar Index, currently unchanged in terms of moves into the dollar. 422 on the US 10-year, so yields just down 1 basis point. A little bit of money moving into US Treasuries. Gold, though, at those record highs of 2,406, so a move into gold, up 0.2%. Bitcoin also marginally higher at 60,835. Let's bring in our M-Live strategist, Mark Cranfield, for the market reaction. What stands out to you? Good morning, Mark. What stands out to you from the Asian session and how investors are adjusting to all of this?
Well, from Asia, it's really all been about China, actually. But if we have a takeaway in terms of these so-called Trump trades, it is that traders have a low conviction on this, whatever they may be, whether it's the dollar, whether it's the yield curve steepening, or whether it's related to the tech market. People clearly don't have a huge conviction they want to throw a lot of money at. And just what's happened here with President Biden has just clouded the waters even further. So there isn't a whole lot going on there. What we have learned today is that the Chinese yuan seems to be under pressure regardless of the situation in Washington. We've seen a lowering of the reverse repo rate by the PBOC today. That was a surprise. And so that has weakened the yuan. Also, we've seen in Asia, the Taiwanese dollar is also exceptionally weak, and that's feeding off the back of the Chinese currency as well. Those things are quite likely to play out for longer. The Chinese economy is still very soft. There was no great impetus from the plenum over the weekend. And so China really is in an economic malaise that is pretty hard for them to get out of. That, on the flip side of that, obviously anyone who thinks that Donald Trump is not favourable towards China as well. But then Washington isn't in general. Nobody here is saying that China's going to be new friends of the United States. So the Chinese currency quite likely will stay under pressure for a while yet. In terms of the curve steepening, it steepened after the debate between Trump and Biden. Hasn't really come down much since then. But now it's beginning to become more like a Fed play. So people have got a high conviction that the Fed will start to lower interest rates probably in September. That's fully priced in. There may even be some speculation about July, depending on what data we see in the next few days. But certainly July and at least one more cut before the end of the year. And that definitely feeds in to people that think there'll be a steeper yield curve, with the short end pushing down a bit further than the long end. And when you've got an inverted curve, it's certainly easier for traders to put that on. And that, in turn, of course, weakens the US dollar. And we've got the Bank of Japan coming up next week as well, where people do expect there'll be some form of tightening, which will support the yen. If the yen is getting a boost, that generally is a dollar negative against the G10 space. So put all those together, bit of dollar softness and curve steepening could continue.
OK, central banks in focus, as well as the politics of the US. MLive strategist Mark Cranfield, thank you very much indeed. Now to the US political story and some analysis. Let's bring in Gorana Grgic, who's the senior researcher in Euro-Atlantic security at the ETH Zurich Centre for Securities Studies. Gorana, thank you so much for joining us this morning. First of all, where you see this leaving this Democratic Party and what your expectation is now around the prospects for this Democratic Party and a potential President Harris versus, or presidential candidate Harris versus Trump in November?
Well, it's truly been a week or so in U.S. politics. It's nothing that any of the sort of historians of U.S. politics, at least in modern times, can really draw parallels to, maybe going back all the way to 1968. When Democrats actually faced similar sort of turmoil. But again, the sort of parallels are not very good there, because it was a different sort of situation altogether. What I would say on the Democratic side, we need to see happen is the following. One, Democrats really need to consolidate now around who the presumptive nominee would be. And President Biden made it clear that he would like Kamala Harris to basically carry that torch. But now, of course, as we've heard from all of your analysis, this is not quite clear as to whether this process is going to be one where there is going to be some sort of internal debate and kind of winning of that nomination, which Vice President Harris alluded to, or actually is it going to be something that is truly a kind of process of continuity now from Biden to Harris that some have likened to almost an inheritance of that title. Second thing that Democrats absolutely need to do is to set the agenda, because for the past couple of weeks at least, and certainly since the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, Republicans have been able to set the agenda, and they have been sort of leading the charge in terms of making certain topics discussed and being sort of on the front foot, so to speak. And then finally, to complete the ticket, Democrats actually need to tell us who that other person, the vice president on that ticket, would be, should Kamala Harris then actually be confirmed in August as the Democratic Party nominee. Because, again, the strategy is shifting now. Obviously, the cards are being reshuffled. And this is one of the things that will be very important, especially given what we've seen on the Republican side around the significance of the pick that Donald Trump made with J.D. Vance.
OK, yeah, certainly we look for that VP pick, don't we? And you talk about the domestic policy uncertainty that a Harris nomination would involve. What about the international response? What about the international policy of a Harris as a presidential candidate for the Democrats, particularly when it comes to things like NATO and Ukraine?
Well, this is something that isn't a sort of story that has just happened overnight or over the past couple of weeks. Indeed, as soon as it became clear that Donald Trump would actually get the nomination from the Republican Party, I think that a lot of allies and partners, as well as American rivals and competitors, have been adjusting their foreign policy strategies. What this means is that basically everyone has accepted that this year, in terms of U.S. politics, is going to be rife with uncertainty, and that this has huge implications on what the United States does post-November, but of course after January 25, when if it would happen, the presidential change might happen in the White House. In particular, what we are seeing on the transatlantic and European front is the way that members of NATO alliance, but also European Union leadership as a whole, are doing things that would, at least for a little bit, make sure that there is some continuity in the short to medium term. Again, should there be a change in the White House? We've seen that just a week and a little bit ago at the NATO summit, the so-called Trump-proofing alliance. But again, what I think is really important to stress is that everyone is adjusting their strategies, knowing that there might be a very favorable change, but for some, again, on the European continent, Trump presidency would have very different sort of implications and strong reverberations when it comes to U.S. foreign policy.
Gorana, really appreciate it. Running out of time, but appreciate your time this morning and the analysis. Gorana Grgic from the ETH Zurich Centre for Securities Studies. And switching focus after the break, momentarily, we're going to look at the budget carrier Ryanair cutting its outlook for ticket prices in the crucial summer travel period, saying fares will be materially lower than a year earlier. We're going to speak to the CFO, Neil Sorahan, next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Now, Democrats have seen a $50 million surge in donations after US President Joe Biden announced he would drop his re-election bid, endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris to replace him on the Democrats' ticket. Harris has received support from senior party figures, including the Clintons, Elizabeth Warren and Gavin Newsom, but will need to formally secure the presidential nomination. Switching focus to earnings now, Ryanair has cut its outlook for ticket prices in the crucial summer travel period, saying fares will be materially lower than a year earlier. Profit after tax declining by almost half in the previous quarter to €360 million. The airline's chief financial officer, CFO Neil Sorahan, joins me now. Neil, thank you very much for joining us. So you've got a downgrade in terms of, or at least you're adjusting your forecast in terms of pricing. The first quarter this time last year, of course, was very, very strong for you guys. You're adjusting to that. When do you see yields improving? When do you see pricing coming back for you?
Well, I think we've had 2 years of double-digit growth, double-digit fares. We're now just seeing a little bit softer pricing. So the consumer is obviously the big winner this summer, Tom. We've seen 15% lower fares into Q1. We're talking about fares trending materially down at the moment. It all very much depends on what the close in August and September fares look like. But our strategy has always been to fill the planes and we price accordingly. We're load active, yield passive. We've got the lowest costs of any airline in Europe and we can afford to do so. Bookings are very strong. We're taking in about 500,000 bookings a night. We're carrying around about 600,000 people a day. It's just that I think the consumer is a little bit more frugal, a little bit more cautious about how they're spending their money and they want to get away. Ryanair has the lowest cost, so we can afford to have the lowest fares. And we're happy to hit the traffic targets. And if we have to price accordingly, we will do.
So demand is higher, but consumers are certainly a little pickier when it comes to pricing.
I think so.
How concerned are you about the consumer right now? How much softness do you see, and how long and to what extent does that prevail?
We're not hugely concerned because, I mean, the key advantage we have is the cost base in Ryanair. We've got 450 million worth of fuel savings already locked in for the current financial year, which means our costs are only rising modestly this year at a time when most of our competitors' costs are rising quite significantly. So we're in a very strong position. We'll deliver nearly 200 million passengers in the current financial year, and if we have to fly at slightly lower fares, very happy to do so.
And those slightly lower fares, they continue throughout this year. Do they turn around next year? When do you see that turnaround in terms of fares?
If you think logically, capacity is usually constrained in Europe. We've got all of the OEMs in London this week for Farnborough. Capacity is going to remain constrained for some time to come. We're already seeing the Pratt & Whitney engine issue on the A320 operators. passengers, likely to run on for another 2 years. Boeing and Airbus alike are behind on their
deliveries. So that
deliveries.
puts something of a floor under pricing, the capacity issue.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, capacity is not going to get back to... We're not even at pre-COVID levels yet. We're probably... peak summer, 97-98% of pre-COVID capacity. The OEMs are going to take at least 4 or 5 years to catch up on their backlogs, possibly into the 2030s. M&A is taking off in Europe. We've got the ITA Lufthansa deal. Air Europa, IAG will probably get the green light later on this summer, and then TAP is going up for sale. So I think capacity will be constrained for some time. Fares will be underpinned by that. And if you look at the fares that we had in the first quarter, and indeed the fares that we may have in the second quarter, they're still well ahead of where they were pre-COVID. We've had 2 years of double-digit fares, double-digit growth. And if we have to see a little bit of a pullback this year and hit the 200 million traffic target, we're still going to be very profitable. We just mightn't be as profitable as we thought we were going to be.
Where are you on those Boeing deliveries?
We're in a better place than I'd hoped we might be at this stage. We're still running about 20 aircraft behind contract. But at the end of the quarter, we had 156 of the game changers. We'll have about 160, just over 160 of those by the end of this month, where we're getting one tonight. We're getting another one in this week. So they are coming in more frequently than they were. The quality is better than it was. And so we're happy with how things are going in Boeing. Our focus now is very much turned towards the remaining 50 aircraft in the order book to get those in for the summer of next year, so summer 2025, so that in the next financial year we can grow from the 200 million passengers this year to about 215 million passengers in the following year.
What was the impact from that global IT outage on Friday? Are you still feeling the impact?
We've more or less recovered at this stage. I have to say I was very proud of our operations team and indeed our IT team. We practiced going manual at check-in in the airports. We were able to get... the vast majority, we had over 600,000 people flying with us on Friday. The vast majority of those got to where they wanted to get to, albeit with significant delays throughout the day. We caught up some more into Saturday, and we're pretty much back to normal. It wasn't helped by the fact that air traffic control in Europe is abysmal this summer. We're seeing staffing shortages on first-wave flights every morning from air traffic control across Europe, and that leads to knock-on impacts. But I have to say our operations team and our IT team knocked it out of the park on Friday.
OK, Neil Sorahan, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, it's a challenging environment, isn't it, with the ATC issues and supply chain constraints as well. Ryanair cutting its second quarter forecast, now seeing fares materially lower. Neil Sorahan, CFO, saying this is good news, though, for the customer out there as you look to book those flights for the summer, if you haven't done so already. Right, plenty more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back now to some other stories making news this Monday, and what will go down as the most spectacular IT failure the world has ever seen. A botched update of CrowdStrike software on Friday affected more than 5.8 million Microsoft devices worldwide. The company says those affected represented fewer than 1% of all devices that use Windows. The issue hit healthcare systems, airlines, and numerous other sectors around the world. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to meet with President Biden in Washington on Tuesday in his first trip outside Israel since its war against Hamas began. He will address a joint session of Congress later this week. It follows Israeli strikes on targets around a Red Sea port in Yemen over the weekend after a drone attack on Tel Aviv by Houthi militants. Chinese banks have cut their main benchmark lending rate for the first time since August of 2023. That's on the heels of the PBOC's surprise move to trim a key short-term policy rate for the first time in almost a year. The cuts come as economic growth slowed in the second quarter to the worst pace in more than a year as consumer spending falls. Coming up, as senior Democrats rally behind Kamala Harris, we're going to discuss what it means for the race for the White House. That is coming up next as markets start to adjust to the prospects of a Democratic presidential nominee in Kamala Harris, what that means for the domestic and international policy of the US going forward, what it means indeed for the Trump trade as we lead up to that November vote. The DNC, of course, has to make that final decision on who will be the official nominee, but right now the bets are currently on Kamala Harris. The details next and the analysis, what this means for global markets. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda. Joe Biden drops out of the presidential race and endorses Vice President Kamala Harris as the Democratic nominee. The unprecedented decision plunging American politics into uncharted waters. Top Democrats rally to support Harris, with her campaign receiving more than $50 million in donations in a single day. But her nomination is not guaranteed. The dollar softens and gold gains as markets wrestle with fresh political uncertainty. We bring you all the market's reaction. So, US President Joe Biden's decision not to run for a re-election has galvanised the Democratic Party, which has seen a surge in donations. Vice President Kamala Harris is now the clear front runner to win the Democratic nomination after an endorsement from Biden and support from several senior party figures. Bloomberg has learned her team is contacting delegates to shore up support ahead of a virtual DNC roll call set for August. We check in on the markets then, with a focus, of course, last week on the Trump trade and to what extent markets and investors are adjusting to the new reality that President Biden will not be leading the ticket for the Democrats into November. The US benchmark 10-year at 4.22, yields just down a little over 1 basis point. The Bloomberg dollar index a little softer, down 0.1%, as we mentioned in the headlines. Bitcoin, 67,741, has been tied to some extent to the fortunes of Donald Trump. And gold at 2,404, up 0.1%, still in record territory, the yellow metal, on the uncertainty of the US political landscape. Let's get the details now in terms of the political, international and market response from opening trade anchor Kriti Gupta and Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, as well as Avril Hong standing by in Singapore. But first, let's go to Washington, where Vonnie Quinn is standing by following all of this for us. Vonnie, where does Biden's announcement then leave the Democratic presidential bid?
Yeah, it's amazing, Tom, as you're saying, how things can change in the space of not even 12 hours yet. It leaves the Democrats more unified, it appears, right? There's been a huge number of endorsements, and they began to come in thick and fast just a couple of hours after President Biden made that post on X, which did catch most people by surprise. He had only just told his aides and staff a few minutes earlier, according to our reporting. But now the donors have spoken as well. Small platform donors, small money donors have given more today than on any other previous day in this race. And by today, I mean Sunday, right? Almost $70 million. And the day after the debate, it was just more than $20 million. That's more than 3 times one of those days, which was the previous record. Big donors are also speaking. George Soros is coming back into the fold. We have Jamie Patrikoff and many other people that had been sort of on the fence. Mike Novogratz, for example, he still wants a brokery convention, but the more time passes, the more it looks like that's not going to happen. The more donors are likely to come back as well. Because, as you say, it's a party that now wants to show great unity, just as the Republicans have been doing over the last several weeks, thanks to some external and domestic issues that arose for the Republicans. Well, Joe Biden finally pulled out. He endorsed Kamala Harris, and the vast majority of not just speakers from the Democratic Party, but also potential challengers that could have challenged Kamala but instead didn't, took a step back, like Gavin Newsom, like Gretchen Whitmer, and said, we are endorsing you, and by the way, we are not running against you.
How clear is the path now ahead for Kamala Harris? How much unity is there within the Democratic Party to get behind the Vice President?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a done deal, right? And of course, anything can happen. I mean, we're still a full month away from the DNC. It begins August 19th. So a lot can happen in a month. A lot has happened in the last 4 weeks, right, Tom? That said, it does look like there is a huge amount of political willpower and some very important figures. I mean, we have Jim Clyburn, for example, saying absolutely no to a brokered convention because the last time, which was 1968, it was extraordinarily messy and it only opens the door to disunity and disharmony and chaos. And it would give the Republicans a win if they were to do that. So he's a very influential voice. That said, anything can happen. She also has to pick her vice presidential pick, and that's also going to be something she needs to think about. That could come any day as well between now and August 19th or August 21st when the DNC is over. She could also try and use that as a path to the White House by, for example, picking the governor of Pennsylvania, for example, Josh Shapiro. That might be a state that it would be very helpful to win. Had been a blue state, it turned red 4 years ago, and it would be one potential path to the White House for the Democrats. But certainly a lot to analyse and chew over the next 24 hours. And we'll be getting polls that reflect the current reality within a week or two.
Yeah, and of course the markets will keep their eyes closely on those polls in terms of trying to get an understanding as to what extent this would change the fortunes of Trump, who's of course been riding high since the RNC and of course since that attempted assassination as well. What have we been hearing from the Trump camp at this point?
Non-stop from former President Trump himself, of course. He's been on a roll, as you say, Tom. I mean, he spoke for 90 minutes at the RNC, which was not something that anybody would have been anticipating. You know, according to previous RNCs, it's typically a pretty short speech. Well, Trump has not been able to stop talking about this decision today. Of course, we know that the Trump campaign had been getting ready to go on the attack against Kamala Harris should a new nominee need to be named, and that happened today. We know that they had spent a lot of money preemptively making ads. We should start to see those ads being rolled out very soon. But today, on Truth Social and various platforms, Trump was basically saying it's going to be much easier to beat Kamala Harris than it is to beat Joe Biden. But let me remind you, that is not what his supporters and the MAGA supporters were saying before this. They had wanted Joe Biden to stay in the race, thinking that that would be the easier way, the easier path to the White House for the Republicans.
OK, the Trump campaign having to adjust their strategy as well on this news. Vonnie Quinn, with all the latest, thank you very much indeed. Now, Biden's historic exit effectively moves his 5-decade career in Washington towards a close and cedes the stage to a new generation of Democratic Party leaders. So what is the Democratic strategy? Let's bring in, at this point, Kriti Gupta, opening trades markets anchor, in terms of how we adjust to this and the expectations around what this means for the Democratic Party and, of course, the election in November. So we'll start there, then, in terms of the potential response from the Democrats and what it means about a potential VP pick as well for Kamala Harris, if indeed she does become the nominee.
If she does become the nominee, and as Vonnie just said, the clock is ticking, not just for the Democratic National Convention, because of the virtual roll call that's expected to come in the first week of August. And the reason this is so crucial is because they're coming up against an Ohio ballot deadline, and that's what the potential VP pick has to now meet. And that's why the clock is ticking. And Vonnie mentioned Josh Shapiro is one of the candidates. Another one is going to be Roy Cooper out of North Carolina. If you look at some of the polling, this is where the Democratic strategy really matters, because you're already seeing the biggest gaps in polling in the likes of Ohio, which of course is J.D. Vance's home state, but you're also seeing it in the likes of Pennsylvania, where Josh Shapiro is indeed governor. Trump has the biggest lead among all the swing states there. So the Democratic strategy among political strategists is likely to be in the likes of North Carolina and Georgia, and that's where the VP pick may come, because those are the swing states where Kamala Harris could potentially have the advantage. And this is assuming she gets all the delegates that Biden has now endorsed. Remember, that is also not a guarantee.
OK, so we have to wait for that detail as well in terms of whether it actually gets cemented in for Harris and then the VP pick, as you say, the focus on those swing states. In terms of the Republican strategy then, riding high at the RNC last week, of course, how do you see the Trump campaign adjusting to this new reality?
So momentum has really been on their side, and you've really seen Donald Trump in particular try to really separate himself to one extent by appeasing the MAGA crowd, as Vonnie was pointing out, but also taking a little bit of a step away from it, really appeasing to some of the more conservative Republicans, likes of Mike Pence or Nikki Haley, that were reluctant to have him be, of course, the GOP nominee. Remember, he also has plenty of Wall Street donors to say, look, I'm going to get the public finances back on track. But remember, he has so much momentum. If you look at what the kind of political strategists are saying, is that now it's less about how much more he can gain in terms of the polling odds, but how much less he has to lose, how much Kamala Harris can now take away from him. That seems to be the focus here, despite him really reiterating some of the policies that he's come to know for. Remember, in Kamala Harris's kind of acceptance of Biden's endorsement, she specifically called out President Trump and said he and his MAGA and Project 2025 agenda. The President Trump campaign and the RNC campaign broadly is trying to create distance from that very message that Trump equals Project 2025, despite that, of course, being the general rhetoric.
OK. Opening trade anchor Kriti Gupta, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in at this point then Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, standing by for us in Berlin on the international reaction, which I think is particularly fascinating. Ollie, what is your sense as to this reaction internationally? As you sit there in Berlin, Europe in focus, Ukraine, NATO, in terms of this momentous decision by President Biden to step away?
Yeah, Tom, I mean, for everybody in Europe, many of the mainstream politicians of the biggest nations here, I mean, Biden was a real breath of fresh air, particularly after Donald Trump, who took obviously a quite untraditional approach to many of the traditional allies here in Europe. And so I think for many of the leaders here, you know, namely Olaf Scholz, who was out on Twitter, for example, thanking Biden, saying that the transatlantic cooperation is close, NATO is strong, the USA is a good and reliable partner for us, and that Biden's decision to not run deserves a lot of respect. And I think that's the tone we're getting from a number of leaders here in Europe. Where it gets, you know, pretty interesting are the two sort of areas and countries that really are reliant on Joe Biden and the United States, both in the form of Zelensky, who says he will always be thankful for President Joe Biden's leadership, supporting for the country in their most dramatic moment in their history. We also heard from Yoav Gallant, who is the the Israeli defense minister, who also thanking Joe Biden for his friendship, and all of these kind of affirmative messages, basically respecting the president. The question is going to be for many of these is not really who the Democratic candidate that replaced him is the question is going to be how does this bear now on the presidential race, because you have very stark outcomes, very different ones between Trump and Biden, particularly when it bears on the question of Ukraine. It's going to be watched very closely. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu was, I think, on the plane on his way to D.C. to go meet with Biden when all of this transpired. So we know he'll be there, arriving there today, meeting with Biden and probably Kamala Harris tomorrow.
What do we know of Kamala Harris's foreign policy? Biden is steeped in foreign policy and has been for decades. What about the dividing lines with Harris? Are there any?
Yeah, so listen, this is a really interesting question, Tom, because really her focus during this administration has really been the southern border, which is, of course, a sort of international role, but not really something that you think about when you think about Europe and China and all these sort of broader themes. I mean, generally speaking, everything is expected to stay more or less aligned in terms of the questions of Ukraine support, the questions of NATO, the questions of toughness on China. Where things do get a little bit interesting, Tom, and this is particularly relevant now that Benjamin Netanyahu is on his way to D.C., is that she was one of the first to call for a ceasefire in Israel, has been more outspoken on the question of Israel and its sort of involvement and how it sort of prosecuted its war with Gaza. So I think that actually is a pretty interesting first meeting to have. And of course, Tom, where this is really interesting is it really draws a very, very sharp contrast with what we heard from the RNC last week, particularly from J.D. Vance, who has promoted a much more sort of isolationist policy and much less multilateralism than you get from Kamala Harris.
OK, Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Berlin on the international reaction to this decision by President Biden not to run as the nominee, of course, leading into those November elections. Ollie, thank you very much indeed. Let's cross over to Singapore now. Avril Hong standing by for the Asian market reaction. Avril.
Yeah, Tom, really interesting, these developments out of the U.S. and the read-through into the Asia-Pacific. Today, we're seeing the Hang Seng get a bit of a reprieve from Biden dropping out of the race. Does this change the calculus for Trump's odds? But that being said, the rest of the Asia-Pacific is really deep in negative territory, with the chip names really extending the declines from last week. And this is not just the concerns about uncertainty related to U.S. policies or that Mag 7, some of them reporting this week, there'll be key tests for an AI rally. It's also Morgan Stanley lowering its view on some of these Asian tech names and saying to take profit. And it's more about how the market leadership could change ahead of the Fed rate cut. A perhaps important reminder here that even as we keep an eye on U.S. politics, ultimately for markets, the Fed might matter more. It's something that we're going to be keeping a close watch on, especially as we look at how the currencies are faring. The renminbi today also under pressure after the PBOC cut rates, surprising with that trim to the reverse repo. Tom.
OK, Avra Hong in Singapore, thank you very much indeed for the market check in that region. To the politics and, of course, the central bank action as well out of China. Coming up, has President Biden's exit from the race put the Trump trade in doubt? We're going to discuss the market reaction in more detail next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Happy Monday. Checking in on the markets, of course, as investors adjust to the new political reality in the US. The momentous decision, of course, for President Biden to step away from that role as candidate for the Democratic Party leading up to the November vote. And, of course, the focus last week had all been about the Trump trade. To what extent are investors looking to unwind or adjust that Trump trade on the back of the news that Kamala Harris could be the nominee for this Democratic Party leading into November? European futures are pointing higher by 0.5%. The Bloomberg Dollar Index, though, a little softer on this news. The volatility, the uncertainty in these markets is, of course, pronounced when it comes to the politics. 421 on the US benchmark. Yields down around 2 basis points. So a little bit of money moving into US Treasuries. Gold at 2,400. It has been sensitive, of course, to the uncertainty and the lack of clarity. The yellow metal up 0.2%. And Bitcoin, 67,616, just a little softer by 0.2%. Let's get more in terms of the views as to how the political landscape is shifting with Marco Vicenzino, Director and Global Strategy Advisor at Global Strategy Project. Marco, thank you so much for joining us bright and early this Monday morning. How do you think these developments position this Democratic Party leading up to that November vote? Is the Democratic Party better positioned now to take on Donald Trump in November?
It's still a big question mark. Still Kamala Harris. She has to prove herself during this campaign. It's still early stage. It would be in her interest and her party's interest if they show immediate unity behind her going into the Democratic convention, which begins on August 18th. So that's roughly 4 weeks away. If there is no, say, internal debates, if there's no one else who presents other candidates who try to compete for that nomination at the primary, and then she begins to build momentum and begin unity in the party. But still, I think right now it's still a big question mark. In terms of the Trump trade, I think that temporarily stalls in the midst of this transformation taking place of the party uniting around Kamala Harris. So I think within a few weeks, we'll see by the end once the Democratic convention is done and the real race begins in earnest, which is roughly after Labor Day, Monday, Labor Day, starting in early September. I think from that point onwards, you're going to start to see the real competition starting. Between now and the Democratic convention, there's still a lot of questions to be answered. And I think, once again, she needs that party unity behind her, primarily the donors and any potential contenders that are competing against her. And I think most of them, like say the names like Gavin Newsom, the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. I think they've coming out in support of her. At this stage, it seems like she's in pole position to get that nomination.
OK, so she's in pole position at this point, but as you rightly point out, more pieces of the puzzle to be put together, Marco. Last week, the Trump trade, part of that focus was on expectations that this is a Republican Party that could come through with a clean sweep of the House and, of course, the White House, the Congress and the White House. To what extent is that now challenged, at least? And is it right to assume that markets would prefer a scenario where there's a little less unanimity in terms of any potential victory for the Republicans in November, that there is maybe a bit more splitting of the powers post-November?
So right now, I would say for the most part, it seems like the Senate probably is going to go Republican, according to the numbers. The House is still up for grabs. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding this. How the markets would accept it, I think right now, it's not. There's no clear answer. I know markets prefer predictability. They prefer certainty. But the situation in the U.S., the political situation, still remains too uncertain. And how market friendly will a Kamala Harris be remains a big question mark. Also, with Trump, for the most part, you have 4 years. You would expect continuity between Biden and Harris, but that's not particularly guaranteed. And a lot of the big money, a lot of the big donors behind her are hoping that she will turn out to be more market friendly, at least more, the markets would perceive her to be more friendly than Biden. Because for Biden, for the most part, right now, there's a reason why the Trump trade has been happening. It's because, once again, it's the fact that the markets haven't been too receptive to a new Democratic administration at this point.
What happens to Bidenomics under Harris?
I think for the most part, she remains, once again, I use that word question mark, an unknown quantity. She has to basically manage, and she's going to struggle between the left wing of a party, a very powerful left wing of a party, and then also the centrist, the more business-friendly elements. And right now, her political skills are very much in question. Certain portfolios that she's been given, she hasn't particularly performed very well. She was first given, the border situation, which she did not handle very well, and several other portfolios. So although there seems to be this perception of unity building around her, her political skills are still into question. Remember that when she first declared to run for the presidency in 2020, she started off she'd raised several $1 million. But at the end, she couldn't even make the Democratic primaries in 2020. So her political skills are very much in question.
OK, Marco Vicenzino, Director and Global Strategy Advisor of Global Strategy Project. Really appreciate the context around what we're seeing out of the US, how this positions the Democratic Party and what it means, of course, for the prospects of that runoff vote in November and the markets. Marco, thank you very much indeed. There's plenty more on that subject, of course, and how the markets continue to adjust to the political uncertainty stateside coming up. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Markets Today and, of course, Daybreak, I should say, and a focus, of course, on the politics of the US. Hold on to your hats because, my goodness, the volatility is there. You go back a little over 20 days and, of course, you see that disastrous debate between President Biden and President Trump. Then you have the assassination attempt on President Trump and now the momentous decision for Biden to drop out. Not a big surprise, but nonetheless a stunning development. And here's how the markets, or at least the betting, is evolving around who is likely to take over the helm then. And, of course, is very much in Kamala Harris's odds right now. The VP, of course, very likely at this point, the market predicting more than 80% chance that she takes on that mantle. And, of course, she has the backing of the sitting president right now at a number of big-ticket names within the Democratic Party. The yellow line, by the way, representing, of course, Joe Biden. We know he is now out of the running. Gavin Newsom of California had seen as a potential prospect, but he comes from the same state, so that it makes it complicated. Harris there leading that position in terms of who is going to be taking on the nominee, and we'll wait for that official confirmation, of course, from the Democratic Party. Let's flip the board and have a look at part of the Trump trade. And part of the Trump trade last week had focused on high yield, so the smaller companies stateside that might benefit from a raise in tariffs on some of their international competitors, but also potential tax cuts from the Trump administration, if indeed that's what comes to pass after the November vote. So we continue to monitor as that spread, the high yield spread, continues to narrow on part of that rationale. Staying with us on Bloomberg, we're going to have more comprehensive coverage, of course, of the US presidential race. Guests throughout this morning, including Thomas Gift from the Center of US Politics at UCL, the Global Situation Room CEO Johanna Maska, Atlantic Council's Elizabeth Braw, and Leslie Vinjaramuri from Chatham House. The opening trade is up next. This is Bloomberg.